Okay, so let's continue. As I said, I'm having you read question 2 of part 1 of the Summa, which talks about the existence of God and proving God, and I'm going to make some comments about that. So remember, this is all in the general topic of natural theology in Thomas Aquinas, the idea of using reason to figure out as much as we can the nature of God. So in this and the next video, we'll be talking about these steps. Remember, the first step was to prove God's existence and then to figure out from that what God isn't and then what God is. Okay? So the first point I'd like to make is a point that we didn't see. This is in a section before we got to where we are, where St. Thomas talks about the Summa Theologica, which is what we're reading, as a spiritual project. It was necessary for the sake of human salvation that there be a teaching in accord with divine revelation. Teaching would be knowledge, right? Divine revelation, again, things like what's in the Bible, beyond the philosophical disciplines investigated by human reason. So this is talking about philosophy. We tried to describe this earlier as philosophy in the broad sense, a kind of rational working with faith to produce something that's not exactly pure philosophy, because we don't simply rely on reason, but it's kind of a hybrid of the two. It's what Christians should be doing. Okay? In this article at the top, okay, the principle of aim of this sacred teaching, this project, this whole book is to convey knowledge of God. And that's where we're going. Now we're talking about what we call natural theology. Okay? And it's a spiritual project. So here's some of the reasons why I think it's a spiritual project. That it's a rational activity. It's using thinking and discussion to move forward and try to know our answers, to know God. So in some ways, this is like what Socrates was doing. But the practical aim is to get Christians to love God better, to inspire, lift up their hearts and souls through rational study to the transcendent God. So we've had this talked about before, about the idea that that's a high calling that can inspire people to want to do things like philosophy, which is very difficult, remember, to want to do it and to keep at it. Reason aids faith in its goal. Again, the idea of a broader kind of philosophy, not a narrow, just simply reason working here. Faith aids reason, so they work together. And the adage occurs to me, you can't love what you don't know. So maybe that's another way of understanding the purpose or the point of this project. Okay, so the first question that arises, okay, so if we're going to talk about God, can we know God? Because the answer to the first question is we can't. Okay, you can't know God. God is a spirit. We are bodily beings who come to know through our bodily experience. Now, this gets stated in a rather technical way in Article 1, talking about knowing things per se and not. Okay, so I'm just going to pull out one quote to sort of focus ourselves so we're not too bogged down in that language. Because we do not know the real definition of God, this, again, think here of the Euthyphro, this proposition is not known per se to us. We can't define God because we can't experience God. At least Euthyphro experienced piety. He practiced it, and so it at least seems possible that he could get intellectually clearer about what he's doing. But we can't even experience God. So instead, it has to be demonstrated by means of things that are more known to us and less known by their nature, visually, or, for example, God's effects. Okay, so God is not more known to us. He's less known to us. What's more known to us is the things that we experience every day. So this is setting us up for the kinds of proofs the 5 ways are. Just after that, there's a very important quote, at least it's stuck out at my mind, that I want to get to next. Okay, so in the reply to the objection, St. Thomas says, the cognition that there is a God is naturally instilled in us in a certain general and indistinct way, for example, or namely, insofar as God is man's beatitude. For man by nature desires beatitude, and what man desires by nature is such that it is known to him by nature. Now, this is an important line. It's a very tricky line, too, for what he's actually saying. And it should remind you of Book 3 of the Consolation. Okay, man, we can't find fortune is not going to satisfy us. But we're not hopeless. We can look inside ourselves and we can see glimmers of how to proceed. We can see that we naturally want to be happy. That's what Boethius says. And St. Thomas says the same thing. Agreeing with Boethius that by the time you get to the end of Book 3, Boethius has proven that that natural desire for happiness is a desire for God. Okay, same sort of reasoning. Man desires beatitude, and what man desires by nature is such that it is known to him by nature. But when he says that, be careful. It doesn't mean that it says it generally into strength. So we have this desire, we don't know for what, and it's very possible that people don't know that it's even a desire for God. We talked about this before. Okay, so this is a theme that's tracking through not just St. Thomas and Boethius, but a lot of different philosophers. Okay, that it's been put into us if we're careful, if we have purity of heart, going back to what Socrates says, we can see something about our lives that gives us hints. Just like these proofs for God's existence give us hints of what else there is in reality that we can maybe get some sort of knowledge about. Okay, so we have to get at it indirectly, and that's the second article. And here's a quote there, and this is put again in technical language, talking about demonstrations or the kinds of proofs. And again, this is the way we need to think about God. There are two kinds of demonstration. One kind is through a cause, and is called a demonstration propter quid. And this sort of demonstration is through things that are prior, absolutely speaking. The second kind is through an effect, and is called a demonstration quia. And this sort of demonstration is through things that are prior with respect to us. For since an effect is more apparent to us than its cause, we proceed through the effect to a cognition or a knowledge of the cause. So don't worry too much about propter quid, quia. These are Latin language terms. Focus more on the process here. So what he's saying is you can either argue from a cause to figuring out what the effect is, or you can go backwards looking at an effect and back up to the cause. And so that's the piece that I want to focus on. Cause to effect, effect to cause. Okay? So for example, dogs are naturally loyal to things that give them attention. And what does this cause? Because that's a cause. Dogs make good pets. That would be the effect. So there would be the reason why dogs make good pets, because they have this natural loyalty. Or we could argue the other way around. Maybe we have some dogs around and we realize they're making great pets, and we're wondering what's the cause of this. And then we infer that there must be a natural loyalty. So cause and effect is the key thing to focus on here, how this is working and how we reason. Okay, so you might think, for example, of someone like Sherlock Holmes. Apparently he's the master of deduction, that's what they say, but he always reasons from effect to cause. He comes to a crime scene, he sees a bunch of stuff in the crime scene, and he draws a conclusion: the murderer must be a male with a limp. And then they go out and see if they can find someone like that. That would be effect to cause. Okay, so God is the cause of the universe. So we could say, and if we assume this, we're in a Christian assumption here. If I could know God directly, I would understand why and how such a being could actually create the universe. I would just see it the way if I knew something about dogs, if I studied them, and then I would see that they would make great pets, they would be really good for drawing sleds, and that sort of thing. I do know something about the universe directly, and so I can learn something from this effect to cause reasoning about the being that created it. That's the kind of arguments that St. Thomas thinks we can have for God's existence. Okay, now he's got 5 of them. They're not original with him. He pulls them out from other philosophers. Okay, he calls them proofs. He says these are ways to prove God, and that might be more appropriate for an audience that doesn't believe in God. But for a believer, I think paths is much more appropriate, because this is the God that the believers believe in, but they don't know a lot about God. Now, they can read the Bible and they can study church teaching and they can learn about God that way. This is a way to learn about God through reason. So that's why I talk about it as reason working with faith. So let's look at the 5 ways. And I'm not so worried about the argumentative steps. That's something for maybe a higher level class. This is just an introduction. So let's look at them from the point of view of what they're doing. They all work in a similar way. They try to find something, and they basically argue that this could not exist unless there was some sort of a thing like this supporting it. Okay, so here I've named the 5 characteristics of God. This might be a good thing to learn here. How can you organize the proofs? Which is the first, second, third? So unmoved, mover, uncaused, cause, necessary being, cause of being and goodness, intelligent orderer of the universe. And the argument for why God, there would be a thing like this, is that there's no motion without God, there's no action without God, there's no existence without God, there's no being without God, there's no order without God. Now, I've kind of muffed the steps together. So what the argument would say is there's no motion without an unmoved mover. There's no action without an uncaused cause. There's no existence without a necessary being. And then the arguments say, but that's at least fitting the bill of what we think God is. God is a being who supports and on which the entire world depends on. So these are the sorts of ways that the world depends on God. So the last column does literally talk about that. What is the dependence that we see on God? Well, there's the dependence of our lives, of all our action, of our very being, of our nature, of our purpose. Okay? So we're looking at, very broadly, again, I'm just, look at the proofs, they're short. You don't have to know every single step and, what is this thing about regress and that sort of stuff. I just want you to know what they're doing and how they work here. Okay? And they provide us with earthly glimpses of a strange God. Because a being which is an uncaused cause, we're going to talk about this in a minute, that's a pretty strange being. We don't know anything like that. All the things that we know about are caused causes and are moved movers. Okay, or contingent beings. So when we start to put this together in our mind, then the picture we end up getting is this must be a very weird being, very different from anything that we've seen. I'll just end with this. What does that say about us? Well, it also says a lot of stuff about us, and this might be the way that Boethius might approach it. Okay, the first way tells us that creatures think that they do everything. And the second way suggests that creatures think they deserve the results of their efforts. And third way, creatures think they are self-sufficient. And the fourth way, that creatures think good originates in them. So these are the mistakes. And the first, second, third, fourth, fifth way actually correct that mistake to say, no, that's not correct. A true view of the world would be you don't do everything. In fact, you can't do everything. You can't deserve everything that happens because you aren't responsible for it all. You aren't self-sufficient. Your good doesn't originate in you or in your efforts. Okay, and you see I'm putting a lot of kind of connections to the consolation of philosophy because it's a similar sort of message, but coming at it in a very different way. So maybe you can see the difference between how St. Thomas and how Boethius approach the same question, the question of the believer trying to understand themselves better and their own shortcomings and trying to understand God. Okay, so let's stop there and take another run at the names of God.